Okay. Why don't you tell us who you are, and then we'll just quickly go around the table and introduce ourselves. You've probably been in this committee in the past, and you may know some of the folks here, but there's a lot of us are new.
Right. Yeah. So I'm Chris Campen, Executive Director, Windham Regional Commission. And we serve 27 towns in Southeast Vermont, the 23 towns in Windham County, Reedsboro, Searsburg, and Lynn Hall in Bennington County, and Weston and Windsor County. And our mission is to support effective local governance and work collaboratively with the towns we serve to on regional matters. You can tell from my accent, I'm in Southeast Vermont. Yeah, great to be here. Carolyn Partridge is actually one of our long-serving commissioners. I think she's probably been a commissioner for at least 20 years. So it's interesting to see her at our executive board meeting during the session. She hasn't been able to do that for a long time.
Is she still on the commission?
She is.
Good. All right. Well, why don't we start, Representative Levitt? You want to just begin?
Representative Levitt from Grandal Chittenden, which is all of Grandal County, and West Milton.
Great.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Dorset, Danby, Langrove, Mount Tabor, and Perth.
Great.
John O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1, which is Royalton and Tucker.
Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
Heather Supnott, Windsor 4, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
David Durfee, I'm from Shaftesbury. I represent Glossonbury and Sunderland, and it's Bennington 3.
Rodney Graham, I represent Orange 3, which is most of Williamstown and Chelsea.
Great.
Jed Lipsky, District 1 of Lamoille County, Town of Stowe. Full disclosure, I was a member of the Windham Regional Planning Commission 54 years ago.
Oh, wow.
19, representing Town of Winhall.
That's great.
Henry Pearl, Caledonia, Washington District, Danville, Peach and Cabot.
Charles Wilson, Caledonia 3, which is Linden, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Newark.
David Templeman, Orleans 3, which is Barton, Brownington, and Westmore.
Great.
And I think you met Laura, our assistant, earlier. Yeah. So yeah, why don't you jump in? And you're here today to give us sort of an overview of the entire
What regional planning commissions are and what we do and how we collaborate.
And I think that we don't have anybody here from Windham County as I sort of listen to folks again.
But the South and Southeast seem to be pretty well represented. Yeah. So Laura, do you want me to share a screen?
Yeah.
Okay. It says you've disabled screen sharing.
Not on purpose.
The presentation that I think Chris is going to put up on the screen is also on our webpage. So anybody would prefer, if it's more comfortable, not to turn that way, you can find that.
Okay. Now there. How are we looking? Yep. Okay. So thanks for having us. The Regional Planning Commission directors, we divvy up tasks of just right now we're introducing ourselves to a number of different committees, recognizing there's a lot of new members and new leadership. Let's see. Good. We'll tell you a little about myself, and one of the reasons why I was asked to meet with this committee specifically. I came to the position at Windham Regional Commission. Actually came from Mississippi. I was on the faculty at Mississippi State there in landscape architecture and graduate program coordinator. But before that, when I was in Louisiana, I founded a organization, the Baton Rouge Economic and Agricultural Development Alliance, and it was a community food security entity that was working with the inner city Baton Rouge to help with food deserts. We were creating farmers markets to help local producers work creating community garden programs, making use of vacant lots in the cities for both really kind of neighborhood organization, but also people wanted to sell at the markets, they could certainly do that, but also for just local, home food security. And then we did technical support, especially for this may sound strange, but like marginal soybean operations or cotton operations, like these small 2,000 acre operations that just couldn't make it. helping them transition down to like 19, 20 acres of fresh market vegetables. And worked a lot with the land grants there, helping the work together in support of small farm needs. After that, I went to work for the National Campaign for Sustainable Agriculture. Now that's called the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and I was their court organizer on the 2002 Farm Bill. So my job was traveling all over the country, working with different organizations, building a legislative platform. When Senator Jeffords went, I guess, independent, I think, it completely opened the door to a conversation about ag policy, and especially smaller scale ag, as is common in Vermont, the Northeast, to really actually be able to get some traction in that farm bill discussion. And so I was with them for a number of years and into the implementation of the farm bill. And then I became a deputy commissioner of planning for Orange County, New York. This was right in the wake of 9/11. And in that position, I was also director of agricultural economic development. And so they were going through a transition with dairy farms, a lot of development pressure post 9/11. Orange County was the county furthest out where New York City firemen and policemen could live. And so we saw this surge of growth in a county that really hadn't seen much growth, and that spilled over into all the other counties. And so developed a really detailed agricultural economic development strategy where we worked directly with farmers, identifying agricultural economic development needs. And my perspective, and not that this is about me, but I just want to share in case I can be a resource for you. My perspective on ag, on farmland preservation, is it's not just about preserving the land, it's about actually preserving making agriculture a viable economic option, because it's really difficult. I'm sure I'm telling what you already know, but in my experience, it's really difficult to maintain agriculture if you don't have an agricultural community and all the support structures that you need, including just the knowledge that the farmers have and that ability to share that information with one another. But it also makes it possible, like for an area to sustain a large animal veterinarian, or weed or other crop service providers. So did that work in Orange County, left there, I became deputy director of planning and zoning for Calvert County, Maryland. And there I represented the county on the Southern Maryland Agricultural Development Council. And that council was really important because this was during the tobacco buyout program. And so this is not a very different type of agriculture, but not dissimilar to what, frankly, we've been seeing in the dairy sector for a long time. But in this case, they had funding through the tobacco buyout program to help them transition away from tobacco to something else. And, these are farms that have been in tobacco for 300 years. And so it was a major cultural shift, typical scenario of older farmers. How do you transition, especially to fresh market production when it's a very different dynamic? Everything from labor to, if you're going into orchards or vineyards or something, how many years can you wait? But all of that kind of, it's not just a snap your fingers and voila, you're transitioning to something else. But also we're seeing incredible development pressures there. We were in the DC, Baltimore, Annapolis commuting sphere. This was a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay. And so water quality was also big for farms too. And so really trying to figure out how do we protect those farms so they can continue farming and be able to resist development pressures, have major purchase development right programs. Then went to Mississippi State, and they're still very active in actually some groups I helped set up when I was in Louisiana, like the Mississippi Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, Southern Sustainable Ag Working Group. But that's my personal background. So more than most directors, I probably am a little closer to ag. So if I get more into the weeds, not everybody would necessarily do that, but I'm happy to get into the weeds with you because it's still where a lot of my passion lies. So regional planning commissions, we exist to strengthen the capability and capacity of the cities, towns, and the state. In the absence of county government, we provide this essential link between local, state, and federal government, especially when it comes to helping municipalities access resources, not just financial resources, but technical resources and other things to pursue their needs. We are a political subdivision of the state. We're actually enabled by statute, and there's a funding formula in the statute where a certain percentage of the property transfer tax is supposed to be used to support us. we don't, I don't think since the beginning, we've gotten that full allocation. Last year was our first time to get a significant increase in 20 years, which came at just the right time. But we provide broad services to every Vermont municipality, whether it's transportation, land use planning, water quality, hazard mitigation, preparedness, climate adaptation, resilience, housing, brownfield assessment, remediation, economic development, energy planning, natural resources planning broadly, whether it's forests or agriculture, and I'll get into ag in a bit more later. We helped the state with policy development and implementation because of our on-the-ground experience. Including me, we have 11 staff in our commission. We are all out in the towns every day, or at the office working with the towns. So we have a lot of knowledge as far as like what towns are struggling with, what their issues are. And so we're a great resource for the state. And oftentimes we're called to serve on different councils or boards. I served on the Climate Council. I currently serve also on the Urban and Community Forestry Council and the Forest Stewardship Committee. We sit on we're asked to sit on a lot of different boards. Oftentimes we're a resource for you guys in different committees and then also for the agencies. Is there a bottle of water or something? I can feel a dry throat coming on us.
There's a fountain.
Okay, that's all right. That'll be fine. Don't worry about it. We're good.
I'll grab you some.
Sorry about that. I should have brought something with me. So Vermont has 11 regional planning commissions serving all of Vermont's municipalities. And feel free to visit our website, if you vapda.org, where you'll see a map. I should say VAPDA, I'm sorry. The Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, it's a nonprofit organization, and what it is really is it's the entity through which the regional planning commissions work with each other and through which we coordinate with our various state partners, which is sometimes that's nonprofits, but for the most part, it's state agencies. And so VAPDA itself doesn't really it's not like we are under contract to do things. It's just the entity that we've set up to work with ourselves. So we meet the first Thursday of every month. It's we alternate between directors only meetings. And then the other months every other month we meet with our associates, and those are typically the state agencies. And so if you as a committee or individuals or ever want to meet with us, we meet pretty much every month. I think some years we take off August. So regional planning at the regional level, we have regional plans. Those plans have standing in Act 250 and Section 248. Everybody know what those are?
We have learned a little bit about Act 250 this morning, not Section 248. So if you want to speak to that.
So 248 is the process through which the Public Utility Commission regulates energy generation and transmission. And so if you look at those statutes, regional plans and town plans have standing. And so regions, we all have plans, are all active and enforced. Towns, if they don't have a plan, they really have very little standing in these processes. And the logic behind that is, whether you agree with it or not, is that's the process through which towns go through due process to adopt their land use policies. And so the idea is before a permit ever comes before some entity like the Plant Public Utility Commission or the District Environmental Commission, the town has already vetted and through a public process and formally adopted a plan that says what their land use policies and priorities are. And there's a whole lot I could get into around this. Increasingly, the courts, because through case law, are increasingly requiring both regional plans and town plans to have more prescriptive language, which is not normal in most states. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but in most states, plans tend to be visionary documents that establish a policy framework from which you would then develop regulatory things like bylaws or ordinances. In Vermont, it's the plans that have standing in those procedures. It's not that there's in Act 250, there's the District Environmental Commission making decisions on permits, but then there's also zoning. And there's some confusion sometimes before who goes first in that. But it's,
sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned earlier, we were talking about who sits on the commissions and their members from each town.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And is it a member from every town in the district, or is it population weighted somehow?
Every town, so each commission has its own bylaws, but every town is our core commission, and this by statute, these are the people who can actually vote on, and I'll get to approval and review and approval of town plans all in a second. But towns have the ability, the select boards or legislative bodies, so the municipalities that are members of the commission can appoint, in our case, it's up to 2. I think that's statewide. Sorry, I don't know that answer. In some other cases, it may be 1, but I'm pretty sure it's 2. And so the towns control, the municipalities control who those people are. Then in our commission, we also have what are called citizen interest commissioners. We have 10, and they tend to represent specific sectors like natural resources, agriculture, conservation, business, healthy communities, community development, that kind of thing. So our commissions are duly appointed, municipally appointed officials that, and I can get deep into the weeds on all of that. Well, if I can walk you further about what authority they have, but generally speaking, they're appointed by their select boards, but they don't necessarily speak for their towns. Only the select boards can speak for their towns, right? Only the elected officials. So sometimes we'll ask them, or they all on their own accord go to the select board and say, what position do you want me to take on this? But generally speaking, what they're expected to do is bring the town's perspective to the region and think about their town's perspective, but also think regionally and hear from other towns what their needs are and what mutual or individual needs they have and how it fits within a larger regional context. So I think that's really important, a really important resource for the state to kind of help towns for us to serve as a resource by which these commissioners can kind of look more broadly about what's going on in the region as a whole, and then hopefully take that back to their towns. We are going to be the first planning commission, hopefully going digital. We're going to have a fully digital plan. The idea behind that is instead of creating a static document that, and may reside as a PDF on a regional planning commission website, this will be a more interactive plan. So like you would be able to see data, you'd be able to change, look at data in different ways, depending on especially it might help not only people who read, but also there are people who are more visual, people who better receive information more visually. And my hope is too, that we can animate things like, and this gets to agriculture, like development patterns over time. All the RPCs do like E911 mapping and addresses. So we can show where structures are and we can show that over time. And typically what you're seeing is most growth is going into rural areas, which is further fragmenting forest land and ag land. But anyway, we're excited to be kind of setting that, breaking new ground there. We also support municipal planning and plan implementation. So we work with towns on updating their municipal plans. And for those that choose to can then also adopt zoning. That's totally their choice. And then towns can choose to bring their plan to a regional planning commission for approval. Now, that has no bearing on their standing in Act 250. There's a little variation in Section 248 where in Section 248, I guess it's energy transmission and generation, and this came up especially with the citing of renewables. In Act 1, what's called Act 174, the legislature said that if towns have just a regular energy planning section in their town plan, they get due consideration of their town plan. If they adopt an enhanced energy element, which really gets into more detail about how they're going to meet targets called for in like the comprehensive energy plan, and the Department of Public Service established standards that regional plans have to meet in town plans. If they adopt that enhanced energy element, then they get what's called substantial deference towards their town plan. I honestly don't know what the difference of that is. In our region, we did a lot around Vermont Yankee. So more than most RPCs, we had to do really deep dives into the whole Public Utility Commission process. And under what's called 248A, this is telecommunication siting, especially towers. Town plans are supposed to get substantial deference, period. But I have to say that PUC has never ruled in our favor. I've not really seen what that substantial deference means. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, I think it's still new enough that we don't know exactly what substantial deference is going to mean in terms of application as opposed to due consideration. So, don't mean to get too far into the weeds, but hopefully I'm just trying to, but I want you to understand what regional plan approval of municipal plans means. What that enables towns to do is apply for like village, like designation status, village center designation, downtown designation, neighborhood area designation, and get access to other grants. So it has no bearing on their regulatory standing really, other than that little caveat on that on section 248. But it really just enables them to access other resources. So the stakes are relatively low. And so, I always encourage towns so really towns ultimately in Vermont, they can choose to have a plan or not. They can choose to implement a plan or not, because there's no real referee other than our review and approval. Frankly, they can choose to follow the state planning goals or not. And this is important, I think, because for you guys just to know, because oftentimes from a policy perspective, the legislature and state agencies will kind of freight town plans with a lot of responsibility. And you'll hear different interest groups say, we've got to get this into the town plan. That's good because it does help the town have a conversation about it. But once they adopt that plan, if they adopt that particular policy, then it may just be done. It's up to the town, whatever other steps they're going to choose to do next. And so that's why I think it's really, we're a critical resource in helping towns facilitate those conversations within the towns, especially around the hard stuff. Towns really are loath to make decisions that influence how people can use their property. And that is absolutely normal everywhere. So planning can be a pretty daunting process, and it's typically done by volunteers. Most towns do not have professional planners. So we provide that critical resource to help them have those conversations. We support community development. We work a lot with our regional development corporations. And a lot of what we do is help them not only have the planning discussions about where development should go, but then also discussions about what infrastructure is going to be needed to make that possible. Now, the state's primary planning goal is to have compact settlements surrounded by rural countryside. That's the language in statute. From my perspective, where I sit, our biggest challenge with that is, and especially in our region in Southeast Vermont, if you look at where communities actually have water and wastewater, a lot of them do not. And so if you have an existing village without a community wastewater system, chances are what you've got is all you're ever going to have. And by that, I mean anything like let's say you have a country store or a community market or whatever, and you want to intensify water or wastewater use. Because of the small lot size, soils, a lot of these are in kind of river and stream plains, high water tables and other things. Chances are, without that community system, first there's a health risk of shattering of septic system, shattering wells, but then also just the rules governing water supplies that go to businesses and wastewater regs. They're probably not going to be able to do anything, and so that threatens their ability to modify themselves, just to continue to exist and have a business model that exists. It also, in a lot of cases, in my experience, precludes any additional housing development in those villages without community water or wastewater. And these are really hard conversations for communities to have because it means change. The assumption is that it's going to cost a lot of money, though actually in a lot of cases, if you look at what it would cost the average ratepayer on a water system or wastewater system, it's about what it's going to cost to one day have to replace their septic system. Especially if you're in this context where you're probably going to, you're going to have to go from whatever it is you've got to probably a mound system or something. But these are hard conversations to have. People also just generally don't like change. I think there's also a fear if you have a wastewater system, suddenly you're going to see this incredible growth like a mini Manhattan spring up. And I'm not making fun. I mean, it's just, I think it's just our tendency to kind of look at it either for those who support it, best case scenario, those who oppose it or are concerned about it, worst case scenario. And that's where we come in. So it's one of the critical roles I think we play is that we are there for the weeks, months, frankly, years that it takes for towns to have these conversations. And you guys will be talking about this a lot. I know there's an effort to push a lot of ARPA funding out to towns and towns trying to figure out how to use their own ARPA funding, and it's time sensitive. But towns are really limited in their capacity to not only apply for, but even receive and manage those funds once they get them. And frankly, and I don't mind sharing with you, I'm seeing towns kind of breaking, and you probably are too. So yes, we support towns in planning and other functions. But the calls I'm getting now is we really can't do this treasurer function anymore. It has just gotten beyond just tax receipts and budget and spending. Now we've got all this federal reporting and everything else that we have to do. It requires a level of professionalization that a volunteer treasurer may just not be able to do. Or lister services or assessors. People, it's getting harder. The demand, now, property values have changed. And you just don't have the people coming into that necessarily want to do the way it's been traditionally done, or zoning administration, or animal control, or bulk purchasing. And so we can help towns work together on these initiatives, and I'm happy to talk to you more about that. But yes.
Is that our chair?
I'm sorry?
Is that our chair in that photo?
Oh, yeah.
Looked like me.
Oh my God.
Representative James.
Yeah, looks like.
I have no idea where that is.
It looks like you were out with the CUD. It was a consolidated truck.
Oh, right. Yes, thank you.
And so we often help the state roll out big initiatives. So like when the concept of communications union districts first came out, we helped stand those things up. The Wyndham Regional Commission, when we were first created, you may have been a commissioner then.
I was.
We helped stand up the Council on Aging, right? And that was actually one of the first big projects, and then youth services. And then we later stood up the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District. So you and Corky Elwell and Pete Van Loon and all those good folk helped stand all that up. And so oftentimes we help stand those kinds of things up, and sometimes we'll fledge them off. Brownfields is a major program of ours. We help remediate. What time is it? I'm talking too much.
No, you're not talking too much.
I have to leave it.
No problem. So a number of, we have brownfields programs or regional planning commissions, and this is a process by which we can provide funding to assess and, yes, sir? Assess and then also remediate sites that have either some kind of hazardous material there, including petroleum contamination. In rural areas, you may think, well, there may not be much demand for this, but a lot of even like the country stores probably once had gas pumps, or maybe they had even a lift for a car, so you got hydraulic fluid. I've not had to deal with many farms, but a number of farms have tanks. Now that may be a whole other separate program. I'm just saying that because you may be a more rural context, it may, that doesn't just necessarily mean that it's not just like in our villages and downtowns where we've got industrial or potentially hazardous sites. Housing, we do a lot around housing, but helping towns, especially with bylaw modernization. And I already talked about the helping them have conversations about infrastructure. Can talk a lot about housing, but right now, the challenge that I see is the path of least resistance remains large lot, single family home development on class 3 town roads, because that's the easiest path. And we are seeing some great efforts I love Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust. We're seeing great projects like in Putney and Brattleboro and Bellows Falls. But we really need to work on getting those wastewater systems in place so that they can then expand out. I'm really fortunate. I live in Townsend. My mom lives in New Thane Village. I used to live right across the street from where she lives. I was chair of the village trustees. It is awesome because in that little village, and Vermont's villages are remarkably intact. If you travel elsewhere through the mountain east, oftentimes they've been gutted or they no longer exist. But here I've got a case where my 86-year-old mom can walk to the post office, walk to the hardware store, walk to a restaurant, walk to a market, walk to a bank. These are ideal locations in addition to our downtowns for additional affordable housing. And if you think about it, our villages have always served as a source of affordable housing. You know, the house we used to live in served as a boarding house at one time. There's another house that did as well. So oftentimes people, that would be part of their transition, right? Even leaving the family farm, you know, temporarily living in the boarding house until you start raising a family, then you move either back to the family home, build another one. But of course, our villages came to be when we used water very differently. Like you took a bath once a week, maybe Saturday night before going to church on Sunday. It took a lot of work to get water into the house, a lot of work to get water out of the house. So our villages weren't set up with that originally in mind. So now we've got to go back in and retrofit that. And retrofitting that will enable these places to have more housing and to achieve that compact settlement pattern. In the water quality realm, we typically work with municipalities. I know you guys within your jurisdiction are working with farms on this. So we're working with not only on like municipal stormwater systems, but critically like the municipal roads general permit, the grants and aid program. We're helping towns meet the state's new standards to reduce sedimentation runoff from town roads into streams, rivers, and ponds and lakes. Geographic information systems and mapping services. Is generally speaking, if you walk into a town office and you see a map, there's probably going to be a regional commission logo in the corner. Oftentimes, if you see like trailheads of the town forest, you'll see the logo there. Maps on the dashboards of the town trucks. We'll typically produce those, so we provide that critical service for towns. But not only that, you know, geographic information systems, what those let you do is kind of layer data and then kind of spatially analyze and organize that information. So for town plans, we tend to create the maps, but for towns that have specific questions related to geography and location of things in the town, we can do an analysis for them. We also tend to help provide them with census data in a way that makes sense, charts, graphs, maps, other things like that. Transportation, we have a specific grant with that originates with Federal Highway Administration, goes through VTrans. And we do everything from a critical role that we play as the state will prioritize projects within the regions. We then get the towns together, have a conversation about what the regional priority should be, and send that back to the state. And we now have the ability to send projects in towns up to the state for consideration. But one of the things that towns really love more than anything else that we do are things like traffic counts, bridge and culvert inventories, sign inventories, and then the required road erosion inventories associated with the municipal roads general permit. Emergency planning, we help towns develop their hazard mitigation plans or local emergency management plans, the LEMPs, that last thing I mentioned. Those are the ones that the select board is required to create each year that says in the event of an emergency, this is how we're going to respond, this is who, this is the phone number. You know, luckily we learned during Irene that it's good for the town to like whoever they appoint as the emergency management director to let them know that before the disaster strikes. Irene really helped us establish a much more robust response system. And part of that now is RPC serves as a local liaison during disasters. So what we do is we communicate, help communicate from the towns up to the State Emergency Operations Center what damages have happened, what their needs are. We're not a replacement for 911. We're not pulling people out of trees or anything like that. We help with communications. And the other important thing I think that we do in our regional commission, we structure ourselves this way. We also communicate with VTrans about what damages occurred, and then also the state river engineer. So we're not hammering the towns with multiple requests. We really try to streamline that communications process. And then also we set a point up to 3 people on our staff to be able to serve at the State Emergency Operations Center, either in person or remotely. Yes, ma'am.
Would that also be, I don't know if you remember last year, but it was an absolutely awful mud season and a lot of the really rural communities were impacted dramatically to the point where folks were stuck for weeks at a time and not being able to get out. Are you the folks who could also help in terms of those emergency preparedness, disaster resiliency? Are you connected in a way that? So
we could relay up to the state that the town's having this problem. In that kind of case, it's going to be more like if it's more than what the road foreman can do. Mm-hmm. They would reach out to their VTrans districts to try to figure out like, hey, is there a technical solution to this? But over the long run, definitely what we can do, is, and a lot of road foremen, it's not in that specific case, oftentimes a road foreman are gonna do that on their own because that's just their, but if they want us to, we could connect them to the districts and then like help them like, so do we need to put in some drain pipes or something like that in this segment of road to fix this? Or are there geotextile fabrics we might want to lay, whatever it is to help kind of make that more resilient. But critically, what we help them do is like through the localized mitigation planning process is identify those culverts that wash out on a regular basis to get those things replaced. And then that also leads to improved like aquatic habitat or aquatic organism passage and terrestrial. There's a lot of mutual benefits to like getting rid of things like ganged culverts or undersized, because not only does it reduce the damage to the roads and potentially jamming up and damaging properties downstream, it also has other ecological and ecosystem benefits too. Energy assistance, already talked about this some. We helped towns with their energy plans, helping them think through also what the implications of the climate action plan are, and what this means for the municipality. One of the things I would say as a former climate council member is the council, it was tasked with a lot. I in that 2 years and a couple of months, I've put 455 hours in. I actually tracked it on my timesheet. But one of the things we need to do is get out more, the council needs to get out more to the towns and the public and explain this is what the climate action plan means for households, businesses, nonprofits, towns, and others. Act 172 would help towns, with their energy efficiency and fuel switching will be helpful, but we need to get engaged more with the general public. And so we try to help towns do that, especially with their energy committees. And then, let's see, this one is the partnerships that we have. We thrive on partnerships. We build whatever the policy issue, we tend to build partnerships within our regions, not only with municipalities, with nonprofit organizations, agencies, and communications union districts are a classic example of that. We help stand them up. In some cases, we may still be helping with the administration. In our case, we did the feasibility study and analysis. We hosted that. And then the CD stood up on its own. But that's something that we really excel at. And then what you really care about. So one of the challenges I think we face is in a lot of different areas like emergency planning, transportation, limited water quality. We have a funding line through, so often has maybe a federal pass through, like our funding to support transportation planning comes through Federal Highway Administration. FEMA, our funding for the emergency management planning grant that we do to support that work comes through FEMA and by way of VEM. But in ag and forestry, it tends to be whatever projects we're able to do. And so we'll work with nonprofits, we'll apply for grants, we'll work with towns, but we're doing a lot, but we do a lot of work in this realm. It's just we just don't have like uniform funding to be able to support like a full-time or part-time planner to do that work on a regular basis. So a lot of RPCs are doing food security and planning projects, working with food shelves and food hubs and other entities like that. Agricultural Economic Development, Northeast Vermont Development Association has the Market Fresh program, a lot of support for grant applications under by statute, Act 171. Towns and regions are supposed to have policies related to trying to preserve large forest blocks and habitat connectivity. And so we help towns with their language in their town plans. Increasingly, we're being asked to provide training on land use planning and climate change. There's a number of us have done work on forest products. Most of us did forest stewardship plans that really looked at what are the forest blocks in our regions, what are the threats and opportunities for our wood products, industries, how that also relates to other ecosystem, multiple goals like ecosystem connectivity as well. Windham Regional Commission, we had funding through the settlement with Vermont Yankee that the state had. And through the Clean Energy Development Fund, we established a modern wood heating program where we help schools install modern wood heating systems. In our case, it's typically wet chip systems. In our region, we have the most productive hardwood forests in Vermont. We have major wood products companies in our area. And so part of the goal of this program, the state's goal and ours, was ultimately to create a distribution system for larger scale modern wood heat systems. That's been a little harder to do. We're also hoping maybe to create more local product, more local sources of that wood. That's also a challenge because it's still heavily oil dependent. But really the importance of working lands and natural systems, and you're going to hear this, I'm sure, a lot, is only increasing as a result of the climate action plan. The role of farms and forests in sequestering carbon, also the soils sequestering carbon, the benefits of regenerative agricultural practices. But then how do you make that an economically viable option for farms so they can continue to operate? So you're going to hear a lot about that. There's a lot of planning that we could help and I mean, I think we overuse planning sometimes, but there's a lot of work that we can do in that area. We don't do as much work with farms as I would like to. I have to go into that. I would love as a region for us to develop our own, and probably in collaboration with Bennington and Mount Scottney Regional Commission, develop an agricultural economic development plan, or maybe we do it for the entire southern tier of Vermont, where we, building on farm to plate, which I'm sure you'll hear about from others, really getting down to the nitty gritty about what in different kind of agricultural regions of Vermont, what economic development opportunities would benefit, but then also tie that into their practices. So, what are the, as dairies are trying to transition or not, or as they're moving to organic or whatever it is that they're trying to do, what other information what else do they need to kind of help stay on the land? So I think that's something more that we could do. And then also you're going to be hearing from, I think you're hearing from Danielle at one. I'm on the Urban and Community Forestry Program. There's going to be a lot of money being pushed out to the towns for trees. There's 1.5 million, I think, in this year's budget. I think the governor asked them, could you use another million? And then at the federal level, I think they went from $88 million for the Urban and Community Forestry Program to $1.5 billion under the infrastructure in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so Vermont could potentially be applying. Danielle could tell you exactly how much, but it's going to be many, many millions of dollars are going to be available for town and community forests. But this is going to be another thing, right? Going to towns, it's a great opportunity. We've never seen this, but you can only, Southerners, I use a lot of metaphors, you can only put so much sausage into a casing, right? And you can only put it in there so fast. And so there may be a role for the RPCs in trying to help get this out to towns as opposed to the limited UC Urban and Community Forestry Program staff just doing it by themselves. And a model that we use oftentimes with state agencies and through the legislature to do this is like the Urban and Community Forestry Program could contract with one regional planning commission, which could then sub out to all the others, and then we sub out to the towns. That means the agency only has to deal with one contract and only has to oversee one contract, and then we manage those other ones ourselves. And it just makes life a lot easier. And I'll wrap up with that.
Representative Cole's got a question, and then we'll open it up to others.
Sure. My first on that point in particular is what do you foresee a lot of this money being used for in terms of forestry now that the budget has increased so much, like particular projects that you think would be beneficial or?
A lot of it's going to be, and Danielle will probably get to this, you'll probably want testimony on this specifically, but especially with emerald ash borer and other invasives, Asian longhorn beetle and hemlock woolly adelgid, beginning to underplant in park situations or even roads, places where you want trees in preparation for those other trees to be gone. And they'll get it to, I don't know how much you guys know about emerald ash borer, but it's a different situation than just regular tree death. That the trees kind of shatter once they're really infected. And some towns in the country, again, Danielle or others can tell you about the details, but some towns have actually gone bankrupt trying to deal with this. I mean, it is a serious problem. And then there's also going to just be hazard, right? So as we have these more frequent wind events, or I would argue also flooding events, because we're going to have more trees coming down in streams and rivers. it's going to be basically kind of like under planting and planning to replace trees that are likely to die for all kinds of reasons. And then like we have more northern species trees that are going to be really stressed as we have hotter, drier, right? The climate picture is really looking at like we're going to have wetter autumns and winters and then drier springs and summers. And so really looking at tree species that are going to be more adaptive to that. So probably more oaks, more like black gum or other things like that. I'm not trying to get to the weeds, but I think that's going to be a real key one though, is preparing for that ecological transition. And I'm not exactly sure to what extent. I was on the Urban and Community Forestry Council several years ago, and I'm new to it, and I'm just not remembering. I don't know to what extent they can support town forests, but also I would hope being able to help with the management of those forests, and there may be opportunities there for carbon sequestration but other also recreation. So is there an opportunity here potentially within forests and parks more broadly, perhaps with BGS and other entities, really working on wayfinding and signage, town forests, and then also I was used to be on the state review committee for the Federal Lands Access Program. In Vermont, a lot of that is going to be U.S. Forest Service land. We collaborate a lot in our region with the U.S. Forest Service. We're increasingly going to be collaborating with Conti because they're going from 125 acres to 3,000 some odd acres. But really having more conversations around outdoor recreation in our forests, and then also how to do that well so that trails are built properly so that people can find their way around them well, and you're doing so in a way that helps support the health of that forest ecosystem and not diminish it. So I don't know exactly to what extent the ECF can be used for those purposes, but that could be another one. Yep.
Going back to wastewater, you said something to the nature of septic mound systems in general costing as much as a municipal system overall. Is there a threshold point for which that becomes a reality? And is there like a less than that where it still makes sense to do it individually?
Yeah, and what we're talking about wastewater systems now, and I would encourage you to have somebody from the DEC wastewater system to really get into the details of systems that have been implemented and how they work and the economics of that, because they can tell you exactly like what ultimately the costs are to the rate, like what the system costs and what the costs are to the ratepayers. But generally speaking, these are soil-based systems now. So we're not talking like a system like what I think I've passed you see the Montpelier one right down on the river when you drive on the interstate. Really for the villages, we're talking distributed soil-based systems. So it could be that like on one side of a highway, because a lot of times right they're transected by a state highway, and maybe on one side those remain like individual septic systems, but they become part of a larger system and they're maintained by that system. So that way, right, they're regularly inspected, they're cleaned, and if a component breaks, right, there's a pool of funding to replace that. So everything is regular water testing to know if you need like a ultraviolet system on water to protect against biologicals that are getting into the well. On the other side of the road, you might have like individual septic and a shared gray water system. Or it may be all the stuff in the pipes go to a larger septic tank, like a community septic tank almost, and going into a distribution system. But we're really talking about designing it to within the very specific context. And really it gets into like the soil, it gets into the groundwater soil type, what kind of biological capacity you can create there. And a group will probably have to come talk to you. They're based in our region, Rich Earth Institute. They're actually looking at composting toilets and what are called urine diversion systems, where those waste byproducts, they're pasteurizing urine and other things, and it becomes really inexpensive, excellent fertilizer for pastures and other things. And the cool thing is, like right now in a conventional wastewater system, when that water goes out, whatever pharmaceuticals are in that, what nitrogen's in there, what phosphorus is in there, I mean, you can get some of the phosphorus out, but it's going into the water. This pulls those nutrients out, and it's like per regenerative system can actually make use of that on the farm. And so it's exciting technology, but I can tell you, working with communities, we did a pilot with them in 2 of our communities looking at maybe like neighborhood scale adoption of this kind of technology. It's hard to get past the ick factor because it's new. But you look at like Vermont Law School, they have composting toilet systems. It's odd because they're not stinky. It's not like using the latrine at like a state park or
Yeah,
something.
like a porta potty. It's not like.
Right. And they actually ventilate from below. Not to get too detailed, but if you use the system at the Vermont Law School, you feel this breeze blowing across your bum. And that's because the odor's going out that way as opposed to a conventional system where it's going out through the.
It's actually cleaner in that respect.
It is, yeah. So that's the kind of systems we're talking about. We're not talking about a conventional wastewater treatment plant.
Yeah. So, and then that could be scalable at any level, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it really does depend on, right, and a lot of and this is why it has to be very specifically designed. It really does depend on, so many of our communities are located right up against rivers or streams, and then you probably have ledge somewhere around there. So there's a lot of really deep specific engineering that has to go into it. But critically to you guys, again, and I can't stress this enough, we're at a place now where the level of investment that's available through federal and state funds and actually making compact settlement possible, because you can actually have money is available to invest in the infrastructure to make that possible. This isn't going to happen again, or I hope to goodness we don't have the conditions that made it necessary in the first place. But this is a level of investment that we've probably not seen since the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, when they invested in a lot of wastewater treatment plants. And yes, we need to work on the ARPA money, which has a very limited timeline. But I think there's also a chance to look at down the road. There's going to be Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act money that's going to be available for towns to do this. So we really need to look at, if they don't meet the ARPA timeline, just still working on getting those systems in place, because otherwise the alternative is going to be chewing up the land that you guys are tasked with helping conserve, and because that really is under Act 250. There are loopholes in it, and what are called 1 acre towns. You can really divide 5 lots without really any permit other than a water and a wastewater permit. In what are called 10 acre towns, you can subdivide up to, and these are every 5 years, you can subdivide up to 9 lots every 5 years. And you can picture somebody buying a farm or a forest and chewing up, so I'm going to do 9 lots this year on this 300 acre farm, and I'm going to do another 9 lots. I'm going to do another 9 lots. You can be very patient with it. And if towns have like 2 acre zoning, which is a lot of towns, their zoning ordinances are very simple, right? You can subdivide that up, unless you say you can't do it in that, if there's a forest protection zone or ag protection zone, that might preclude it, but a lot of towns don't do that. And so we created what are called measles maps that show towns, like under your 2 acre zoning, hypothetically, this is what development on every 2 acres would look like. Now, obviously that's not going to happen, but it's really easy to chew up a lot of land. And that can be, I've lived in states where they never thought they would see growth or development, and then they begin to see it, and then they wind up chasing it because they didn't have the rules and the infrastructure in place to support that compact settlement. And what I find with Vermont is that, and this is really a New England thing, I think. Elsewhere in the country, they have no qualms about building infrastructure. Now build the infrastructure, and then they chase it with the planning once they figure out, oh gosh, we got to build another school, we got to build another fire department, we got to do all these other things. New England and in Vermont, we have a lot of the right policy language, but we've not invested in the infrastructure to actually make those policies real. And so I'm trying to have more conversations with conservation groups and others about, you really need to get on board with the whole infrastructure thing, because land conservation is one side of the coin. The other is, so where are we going to grow? Where are we going to develop? Where are we going to be developing for Vermonters? Because as we've seen with the pandemic, as we've had more people move in, we've used up the supply that we had. And now there's a really real question as you're trying to age in the state, no matter what your stage in life, are you going to be able to find housing? If you've got the means, you might have to leave and hope you can come back. Alternatively, you might wind up in a really unfortunate living situation, or certainly not ideal. And the worst case scenario, right, is homelessness. And that's really where we are. But I hope we'll also take the long view, not just the immediate needs, but making those investments to make the compact settlement and everything else that means possible. And the other benefits of compact settlement, I think, for agriculture is that also creates more of an opportunity for local foods. And it makes local markets and all more viable because you have more people like right there who can walk to it, support it. And so it's, it's not a panacea, but it certainly creates conditions that are more amenable to supporting local food production and value added and that kind of thing. I also participated in the legislature authorized committee working with the Natural Resources Board and Ag and Markets to look at regulation of on-farm accessory businesses. I was part of that.
You were part of that group?
Yeah, and I will say because from my perspective and experience, I tend to be more permissive of those accessory businesses because of how they can contribute to farm viability. Recognizing that there are a challenge, not just allowing everything, but what we did in Calvert County, Maryland was historically farms, would have a wheelwright or somebody or a blacksmith, and that would be their side business. People would come there because they would have that expertise or skill. And so we're even looking at doing things, and this was easier for us to regulate at a county level because it was county level zoning. But things like if somebody had a small engine repair shop, allow that. If they had a diesel repair shop, allow that. You're not going to allow a bunch of trucks parked there all the time. But again, within reason, allow these things so that they can kind of diversify their businesses on that farm so that farm could stay a farm and not just eventually. Conserved land tends to retain its value pretty well, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be an operational farm. It may become more of not knocking hobby farms and gentlemen and gentlewomen, gentle people farmers, but that then gets into, one of the things that the dairy farmers in Orange County were commenting about was they were kind of staying operational because of the services they were providing to the people who were buying up dairy farms and converting them to horse farms. So they could do the haying, they could repair the tractor and all that stuff. You were going to ask a
John, yeah, go ahead.
Could you speak to the sort of weight of regional and town plans? Like, as far as, I'm on the select board in Tunbridge, we have a town plan. Say something like, in our town plan, it says, let's maintain forest blocks, large forest blocks. In the meantime, private landowners have a different idea for those forest blocks. And our town plan turns out to be, it's an aspirational document. It's not, you're not breaking any laws if you develop those forest blocks as a private landowner. So could you talk to that as far as the regional plan too, is it gives you standing maybe to fight something out in court, but it.
In your case, does Tunbridge have zoning?
No.
Okay. So this gets to the whole court language thing. If the language is passive and it says large forest blocks should be maintained and habitat connectivity should be maintained, it may be a struggle because what the courts are saying is you really need that shall, must, will language. And so it should, so really the plan should say something to really have force. And just so folk understand, it is the district commissions that interpret town plans and regional plans and apply them. So when we say town and regional plans have standing, you have to participate in that process, represent your plans, defend them, say this is the intent, here's the policy language. And of course, the applicants are supposed to have that language in there too. But you're going to have stronger footing if you have that prescriptive language. But that can be really hard for towns to do from a very practical perspective. And so one of the things that I had asked that got included in the climate action plan was suggesting the legislature form a committee to really look at a wide array of state policies that there are a lot of state policies that depend on town action, and this is like critical stuff. Some of it's life safety stuff. So there's a bill that's been introduced, I think, in House Natural Resources about river corridors. Now, I'm not getting into whether you agree or disagree with limitations on development in river corridors because of flood hazard risk. The idea there is that with fluvial erosion, the land washes away, the house washes away, the barn washes away, right? That's the risk. That's a health safety thing. Right now under law is towns have the option of adopting that. So to my mind, if the state is serious, like this is a critical policy that it says must be met for the well-being of the state of Vermont, the conversation I think we need to have at the state is at what point is that more, should that be more of a state level regulation and responsibility, or should it be left to the municipalities? And the other option there too, right, is deferred. You can also give the municipalities that option, but it would need to be regulated at least at that level. You know, like under the Federal Clean Water Act, states, you know, can, and Vermont does this, regulate to the standards of the Clean Water Act, but states can actually have more rigorous standards too if they want to. So I'm not king of the world, but to me, it's just a conversation that we as a state need to have, so that if you want to maintain that forest block continuity, should that be more of state regulation, something that ANR and DEC regulate through the Act 250 process? Or should it solely be left to the towns through the town plan language and then whether or not they adopt zoning? And so that is a challenge that towns are going to face. And same thing goes for agriculture, right? It's, you know, and there are those loopholes, or not loopholes, but just those thresholds in Act 250 that certainly can enable a farm to be developed. You know, some of the best lands that we have and that we say we need to conserve for any number of reasons, whether it's food security, water quality, carbon sequestration, or other things. And so that to me is a conversation that we just, you know, in a perfect world, it'd be a very objective and dispassionate conversation, to, or at least we can just talk about, if you're trying to get from A to B, are we effectively doing that under the current system, and then figure out the policy and the political aspects of that. But I think we really do need to have that conversation.
Charles?
I come from a very rural part of the state, except for Lindenville, which is a small town, but I've had constituents call me, and there's a lot of them say, we don't want the state involved in anything, leave us alone. Mm-hmm. And
we have that too.
my question is, does the farmer and the citizen really have a say in things anymore?
I think, I mean, in Vermont particularly, they do. I may not seem that way, but relative to other states, and this will be part of that whole conversation I was just mentioning about, like, if these are the state goals, how do you get there? Or, you know, honestly, are some of these state goals more aspirational, like the Climate Action Plan and Comprehensive Energy Plan, river corridor management, and other things like that? And that's, to me, is the conversation we need to have as a state. It is the regulatory rubric for farmers and forest owners is definitely getting more and more detailed and harder to match. And I don't really have good insight here. I've had excellent insight in other places, but as far as like what level of technical assistance they're getting, or financial assistance, or even the ability to apply for grants, like the kitchen table, sit down, do the application, submit it to USDA or whoever it needs to be. So I would say, yes, their lives are getting harder. They probably have less say so, I mean, to be honest about it. But I think under the Vermont systems, they actually probably have more latitude than they would other places, because of, like, even under Act 250 and zoning laws, the relatively low threshold to challenge permits that get issued, and the ability for people to appeal Act 250 decisions. So I would say the answer is yes and no. I don't have a magic answer to that, because, you know, oftentimes, you know, and one of the things I think we need, one of the things I really, really wish Department of Ag could do is tell us what's happening to the farms as they're being sold. Are they getting purchased by an LLC? Is the farmer themselves creating an LLC? Recognizing that is, in many cases, is the farm family's exit strategy. That is their wealth. And that may be what they have to do if they go out of business to pay their debts, or it may be their retirement strategy. But it'd be really good to understand what's going to happen with that land. And it's good to know, not because, like in a farm community, I think this will be the case where you're at, because my experience in most ag communities, it's good for farmers to kind of know what's coming. Because if that's going to be ultimately become residential land, if that's land, that may be land that they can no longer lease, right? Because a lot of farmers don't necessarily buy land; they lease other land for pasture or haying or other things like that. Is that going out of play? As those businesses go out, are they no longer be able to have a large animal vet Are they no longer going to be able to support like a true agricultural equipment service, or is it going to be more hobby? In other words, no more larger scale planters or other things like that, but more smaller scale Kubotas to mow. And so I think hopefully farmers, well, in a perfect world, farmers would be able to have more conversations about what the future means for them beyond even like the dairy markets or whatever market it is that they're in, but also just like, and this is where those ag economic development plans I was mentioning come into play, like really understanding what the risks and opportunities are and what can we do to kind of keep our businesses going and keep ourselves and if our family, if our children want to stay on the land. That may not be what you wanted to hear, but that's my experience at least.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'll just say, I mean, it's not, I know a lot of people think that's the Northeast and elsewhere, that's really rural. Our smallest town's population of 5, that's Somerset. Searsburg is a population, I think, a little less than 100, and they were the only town in the state to reject federal ARPA funding on a philosophical basis.
Oh.
Reedsboro is very conservative, it's on the Mass line, so is Whitingham. So it's not just a Northeast Kingdom thing. I mean, even as you go further south, we actually have some fairly remote towns. Reedsboro population, I think, is 300. So it's a statewide conversation. I think we need to have.
Not very big.
Yeah.
Compelling reason to be on your planning commission.
Regarding the tree program, the tree planting program you had brought up, you had put forth the concept of perhaps, as global warming pushes warmer weather further north, we would change up what the plantings would be. For example, I think you mentioned red oak.
Or more, just whatever that composition makes sense. Yeah.
Are there rules or laws that govern like native plant? No. So it would really be whose decision? What's the conversation?
I think it'd be up to the towns, but I think probably, I'm new back to the Urban and Community Forestry Program, and Danielle can answer this question in great detail. But I think there are probably going to be some parameters, I think, where the preference is probably towards native species, and in large part because you want something that is it may be things that are not commonly planted as street trees or park trees or something like that now. Think about American elms. Beautiful trees, that kind of vase-like form. Put on my landscape architect hat. One of my degrees is in landscape architecture. So, we had these beautiful streets lined with these big vase-like, American elms. And then Dutch elm disease came in, killed them all. And so then you just had to start going in with others. And so there's going to be, I think it's definitely going to, maybe the rules are discouraging what are called monocultures, where you have the same tree type, because that really helps diseases and insects spread. And so as opposed to having one type of tree, having more other species. And the idea is, I think, for the program to advise, I don't think it's necessarily dictating, but saying, the science and best practices, would be an ideal mix. And you'd want it, right, it's going to be related to soil compaction, soil type, moisture, microclimate, lots of things. So you'd have a big list, but you'd want to stay away from ashes anymore. Would want to stay away from hemlocks. If depending on what happens with maples, you may, maybe fewer sugar maples in parks and more like red maples, and just that kind of conversation. And it may be too, in some cases, really figuring out like where shade trees are most appropriate, the really big ones. And whereas you may instead want to look at like a lower canopy tree, just for ease of maintenance, but also if you're trying to, in some cases, like mitigate property risk or other thing. If you have a really big tree, and we expect more, as part of climate change, more severe wind events. And so maybe you want lower canopies in some cases, in other cases higher. So I think the program is going to be flexible, but Danielle can answer that for you. But I don't think it's going to be, you have to do X, Y, or Z. I think that would be part of like what, if they wanted us to, like regional commissions and others, we could get staff trained up or work with UCF staff to come in and advise like on this specific place, this is what would be recommended. So the burden's not on them to figure that all out by themselves, because they got enough to deal with.
If this is a question for Danielle, that's fine. You can tell me, but is there ever a place of intersection for the forest conversation and the food security, food sovereignty conversation? So leaning toward, whether it's walnuts or hazelnuts or things that can be that can do both.
That's part, I think that's actually, historically, where my landscape architecture at, what we would always teach our students is having more edible landscapes. So not that you're literally eating it, but in places that are suited to it, have more fruit trees where people can just pick them. Have more nut trees and, things that where you could basically do what we used to historically do, where you would go and gather these things up. There's also, you need to be real careful, but like wild foraging in the woods where I grew up, ginseng was a big thing. And I think they even had on Discovery, a series about ginseng hunters, and they really, dramatized it, but they would over harvest and in some cases do some damage. But there's the whole agroforestry concept. There's also introducing, having more kind of integrated farms where I know some farms in our area, it can actually be beneficial sometimes, like to introduce hogs or other things into that, and that it also then captures the waste. It's that whole regenerative system. It also provides shade, having more. It may make sense in some cases have more trees and pasture to help better shade the cattle or the livestock, because as it gets hotter, giving them more shade and shelter. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but in the urban context, it's absolutely.
And it's part of the conversation. My question is is it rooted in, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But that would be the kind of thing you'd want to work with the town on in developing its plans. There's what are the options there? So that's where apple trees aren't necessarily native, but they're certainly nativized and
native value.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so one of the things too, that, the state, that the experts can advise on are then now, given the way we think we see the climate changing, what are the species of apple you're going to want to plant? Are there some that are going to need, as we have fewer cold hours, are there some that are going to, and are there going to be some that are going to be more resistant to late frosts, right? We're going to have more late frost. We're going to have more early frost because of the whole kind of global weirding. And so just advising on what kind of species you would do to make that a more, help those trees survive. And on my own property, I'm doing a stream restoration project. I can tell you it is not cheap to do this stuff. So there's a real, to my mind, a real economic development opportunity here for some people who are interested, because it's going to take some time, but there's going to be a need for a lot of plant materials. That's a fancy name for trees, shrubs, whatever else. And so somebody's got to grow all this stuff, because nationwide, right, there used to be the Urban and Community Forestry Program was fighting for 88 million. Now they got 1.5 billion. And so nationwide, that's a lot of plants. And so that could be an option for some people.
Yes, just a quick one. How do you sort of balance, as regional planning commissions, do you feel like you're mostly sort of reactive to what towns want, or are you, like a therapist, football coach, as far as being sort of, this town is ideal for this sort of development or not this development, and
it's both.
Just to stay away sort of from policy like legislative council?
No, it's both. And I'll be honest, our real challenge is the Rural Commission, or Rural Coalition, Rural Caucus, is, they're proposing a bill that would look at local capacity. We have I'm really glad they're pursuing the initiative. We have some questions about the bill. But our biggest challenge is so much of our funding it has these guardrails. And so the legislature narrowly defines, this is our priority for you. Here's the funding. This is what you can use it for. What we're really losing is that capacity. And this, I think, was the intent of the original, the property transfer tax source, was give it to these commissions with these town appointed members and pursue your priorities based on what your towns need. We've kind of lost that. and that latitude. Because really what I need to do is hire people as opposed, because right now when I'm bringing people on, it's tending to be within these narrow stovepipes, whether it's through a solely state funded program or something passed down through the Fed. So like our Transportation and Planning Initiative, it's an awesome agreement we have with VTrans. We love the structure of it because there are goals that we need to meet and tasks we have to do, but they give us the latitude to do it in ways that make sense for our region. We love that model, but we can only use that money for transportation. If we have water quality money, we can only use it for, and the A&R contract's going to be really constrained. And so we can only use it for these specific tasks. But when a town calls us, and I've, this has happened in the last week, I don't know what to do about our treasurer system. We need to move to a more professional financial management system. Can you help us with that or help us join in with other towns to do that? And what I need is the staff capacity to do more of that work, because really that's where the demand is. I don't know exactly what it's always going to be. And so, yes, there are the situations like Londonderry, we've been working with them and others for years on when you're ready, let's get you funding for wastewater management system. But a lot of that, there's the months and years of conversation ahead of that about even being willing to accept that or even decide if you're going to have that conversation. So I need the latitude to have that, as opposed to oftentimes the only times towns can really hire us or anybody else to help facilitate those conversations is once they get a grant. And so then this gets into equity, justice, all kinds of other implications of it's like those who have the capacity to pursue it do, those who don't, and then others get left behind. And so we make that really hard. Well, we need the latitude to just have the people on board to respond to whatever it is the towns need. Intermunicipal agreements, having more shared services. So like, do you share a treasurer, kind of a circuit rider? It may not always work because sometimes the hour demands are just more than what, but hypothetically, or certainly zoning administrator, floodplain administrator, more intermunicipal agreements on bulk purchasing, that kind of thing can work really well. But that's another conversation we need to have. Chittenden County, I know that's our more urban county, but they still have some very rural towns. But because of those towns had more capacity, they've done more intermunicipal agreements. And they're finding the limitations to those on the efficacy and even the town capacity to manage those things. And so that's just another kind of conversation that we need to have. But anyway, if I had to say, if there's one thing that I could wave a magic wand and change, is just give us more latitude to hire and retain the staff over the long term, because the demands for these services are not going to change. They're only going to become more acute and severe, and we need to be able to staff up for the longer, because a lot of the benefit of us is the relationships we have, and we know people over the very long run, and for even those we don't, at least we know the history of how they got to where they're at. Because we tend to be kind of the archivists for the towns and kind of, in some respects, even their institutional memory. So long answer to your question, but it's a really important question, I think, for the state as a whole. So hopefully we can get to a point where we have a conversation. I would love to be able to have the opportunity to say, like, recognizing our role and just having a conversation instead of kind of asking us, would this work for you? Have more of the conversation of what do you need based on what the towns are telling you they need. And then also from a regional perspective, what could you do at a regional scale more effectively that the towns say they want to have happen at that scale to make good things happen. One of the things that Vermont's challenged with in the absence of county government, not advocating for county government, but you don't have an aggregator of fund. We don't have an aggregator of funds here in between the state and municipal levels to do intermunicipal projects. Like if you have counties, you have county level taxes. They're doing county sewer systems. They're doing intermunicipal roads. You have that level of investment in the middle. We don't have that here. Not saying we should, but it's one of our challenges, is everything is either really hyper local or it's from the state down, where you start losing some of that local input that you might otherwise want.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you for making the drive up, particularly. And are you visiting others today Yeah,
I'm actually going to link. I'm curious what the governor's going to say this evening about the climate change and energy but also meeting. This is one of the great things about being back here in person is just an opportunity for us to meet with people we used to see in person all the time. And so like with Katie Buckley at the VLCT, another director and I are going to talk to her about intermunicipal shared services and local capacity. So it's just RPC, whether it's me or somebody else, just so you know, during the legislative session, we typically have somebody up here every day. So you can reach out to any of the directors and just kind of say that in your region, just say, who's up there today? I need to just ask them
Good to know.
a question. So,
Good. All right, well, thank you.
sure, thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
Very broad.
I think we're,